Ephesians is in 3 parts. You should be able to break it into chapters 1, 2, and 3. And this is the call of a believer. Then from 4:1 to 6:9, the conduct of a believer. And from 6:10, it's really 6:10 to 20, and then there's some personal notes. But suffice it to say, conflict of the believer. And so here, this is the process of pagan to Christian. This is the process walking as a Christian. And this is the process of warring as a Christian. In other words, you were born again into a war. And so here we're going to celebrate the movement, the process of someone being called from being a pagan to being a Christian. And it occurs to me, let me offer a situation for you, okay? Paul is he's under a light chain of arrest. He's sitting in Rome. He's waiting to go before Nero, okay? That's the situation. But in the Roman Empire, if you were reading the Roman Tribune, the daily newspaper would say that there's increasing tension. Taxes are rising because they have to supply the expansion of the army that's going on all over the Roman world. The once great landowner army of the Republic had now become a professional fighting force. You should know this. Just about the time of Jesus' birth, the Roman Empire went to a professional paid army. Before that, it was people who were trying to gain status in a land-owning families, but now they have a professional foot soldier and there's a regular paycheck, etc., etc. So by the time of Paul, which is really a generation later, what you find is that people are being taken into the Roman army. So let's say Jonathan is a captain of the Gauls. He is a big, hairy Gaul. He wears he looks like something from a Viking movie, and he's got, wild hair, and he wears like bones around his neck and bear skin over him, and he has a pair of pants made from deer skin, and he's a tough, rough Jonathan, okay? Jonathan of the Gauls. Now, he is in charge of an entire group of men, but the problem is Luke is a centurion of Rome, good, solid Italian blood, and his men are better equipped than the Gauls. And so he comes out, he fights against the Gauls, and Jonathan's men from the Italic tribes actually rip apart the army of the Gauls and take captive Jonathan and some of his key men. Now, here's the problem. Rome could either try to subject all of them to being Roman citizens and kind of beat them down, but all that Jonathan's ever done is be a captain of an army. He knows how to fight. He's not really good at anything else. And so he's good with a club and a spear. And so what they do is they move him from being a captain of the Gauls to giving him the opportunity to sign on to the Roman army and eventually become a Roman captain. They can move him from the position of responsibility in the old army to the new one. But there is a process that goes on for you to move from being a barbarian to being a Roman. Now, there's a reason I'm mentioning this. Paul is in Rome. He's under a light chain of arrest, and during the time he's there, let's face it, the guys who are guarding a 5-foot-tall balding Jew by the name of Saul of Tarsus are not your frontline Lucan Roman big men they're out there fighting the battles that are going to get them spoils of victory, and they're going to get rich and earn glory points. Who gets stuck with this lousy duty? The Jonathans. The barbarians that are being settled into the Roman army get the worst duty. So imagine Paul is sitting in his place in the tanning area, because he was a tanner and a cloth worker. And the place stinks like urine and sulfur, because that's what they treat the cloth with. And so he's staying in this place. And here's this guy, Jonathan, who was a captain of the Gauls. And he's gone through the process now to become a Roman. But he's basically upset because he's a second-class Roman. And instead of getting out on the front lines where Luke is, all he gets to do is guard this stupid, bald Jew. Now, imagine he's arguing or he's mumbling and grumbling about this, and Paul hears it. At the same time, Paul is allowed to bring in guests from all over the Roman world who can come and see him. And in the guests that come and see him, he's starting to hear about how Judaizers have come into churches like Ephesus and have told them, you are not real Christians. You are second-class Christians, because you aren't circumcised, don't keep Sabbath. You are not what we are. You do not have the full, complete place. Okay, you can call yourself a Christian and I can call myself a Christian, but you're a second-class Christian. So Paul uses a contemporary problem in the army to describe and discuss the same problem in the church. Okay, have you followed my line? Okay. Now, if I were going to take Jonathan from being a captain of the Gauls and make him a captain of the Romans, he's got to go through a couple of things. First, he needs a basic education in what it means to be a Roman. So they're expected to cease living as a barbarian, okay? So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give him an education. Cease barbarian activities. This is the first thing I'm going to do. After that, as I start to do that, he needs to understand the people who are what's the order? What's his place in society? So he's going to need to know his place in society. Why does he need to know that? Because he doesn't even know where to sit in a theater if he doesn't know his place, because the size of the seats are determined by your station in society. So he needs to know not only an education, but he also needs to know his place. And beyond that, he's also going to need to know rank. He's going to have to know who ranks above him and below him. What are the signs and insignias of rank? Now, in order to get him to understand these things, a couple things are done. The first thing that happens is a barbarian, in order to make him a Roman, is given a piece of land. Now, he doesn't actually get a piece of land. He's given a token for a piece of land. It's a little round circle that he puts on the bottom of his front armor, and that has a number, a Roman numeral on it. That's the plot of land he's supposed to get when he retires. Now, what he doesn't know is that 1,000 other guys have that same number, and they'll all die before they ever get there. But nevertheless, he gets a piece of land or an inheritance. In addition to getting a piece of land and an inheritance, he also has to be adopted by a Roman family. He needs an adopted Roman name. How many of you know the name Flavius Josephus? Do you know this name? Josephus Flavius? The Flavian or Flavian dynasty was the dynasty of Domitian, of Titus, and Vespasian. They were Flavians. When they took Josephus, he was a captain, a Jewish captain who was hiding behind a rock. When they took him captive, they made him into a historian, but they adopted him. So he's called Josephus Flavius. He gets a Roman name. So even people who were picked up in war, like Jonathan, will get a name of a Roman family. All right? I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. In addition to that, they have to go through civilization classes. So to cease barbarian activities, they have to be civilized. One of the things they have to know is how to bathe. That sounds ridiculous, but people didn't have bathtubs in their houses. Bathing was a public activity, which means you needed to know where to go in the bath. You needed to know where the potty was. You needed to know how things worked in a Roman society. One of the things you would have had to do if you were a Gaul is get your hair cut, because that big mangy dreadlock-like hair would have had to been cut down to Roman hair. We're going to civilize you. And then we're going to train you in the rank of a soldier. And when you're done, you're going to understand what it means to be a soldier of Rome. Now, listen to that process. Now look at Ephesians. I'm going to read through and have you underline, and then we'll come back and look at how Paul addresses this issue of moving from being a pagan to being a Christian. It's a mirror image of moving from being a Gaul to being a Roman. Does that make sense? All right, let's do irreducible minimum for chapters 1, 2, and 3. Let's do our best to maintain focus. Chapters 1, 2, and 3, irreducible minimum, okay? Verse 1. Paul to saints at Ephesus. Paul to saints at Ephesus. Verse 2, grace and peace. Verse 3, bless God who blessed us. Verse 4, he chose us. Verse 5, he predestined us. Verse 7, in him we have redemption. Verse 8, he lavished wisdom. 9, he made known mystery of his will, or the mystery of his will. He made known the mystery of his will. End of verse 10, in him, verse 11, we obtained inheritance. We obtained inheritance. Verse 13, you also believed, you were sealed. Verse 15, I heard faith among you and your love for saints. I heard faith among you and your love for saints. Verse 18, I pray, eyes enlightened, no call, inheritance. Verse 18, I pray, eyes enlightened, no call, inheritance. Okay, I know it's a little choppy, but it's the best you can do. Verse 19, and his power. Now, I want you to take in verse 20 the word raised and the word seated, underline both of them, and then draw a line between verse 19, power, down to raised, and power down to seated. This is what he did. His power raised him from the dead. His power seated him at the right hand. There's one more I want you to do, and that's in 22. Put all things in subjection. His power raised Jesus. His power seated Jesus. His power put all things in subjection. Okay, very quickly, take a look at Ephesians 1, beginning in verse 1. Paul, to saints at Ephesus, grace and peace. Bless God who blessed us. He chose us, verse 4. He predestined us, verse 5. In verse 7, in him we have redemption. Verse 8, he lavished wisdom. Verse 9, he made known the mystery of his will. Verse 10, in him, verse 11, we obtained inheritance. You also, verse 13, believed and were sealed. Verse 15, I heard faith and your love for all the saints. Verse 18, I pray, eyes enlightened, no call, inheritance, power, raised, seated, and put all things in subjection. All right, so here's your problem. I want to take Jonathan of the Gauls, captain of the Gauls, and I want to make him into a Roman. The way I do it is I'm going to give you a Roman name. I'm going to give you an inheritance token that you put on your belt. I'm going to send you to civilization classes. I'm going to cut off your dreadlocks and give you a Roman hairstyle. And I am going to take away that old uniform of yours. And the last thing I will do when you graduate is give you the armor and uniform of a Roman soldier. What you're going to see in Ephesians is that the first part of Ephesians is really the process of making a Gaul into a Roman was the same process of making a pagan into a Christian. In other words, look at what you got when you came to Christ as someone who did not know Jesus. Okay? And he will go back and he will say, I'm writing to saints in verse 2. This book is written for Christians by Christians. Okay? Then in verse 3, he starts off with a blessing and makes clear that what God did was chose you, predestined you, redeemed you. The word redeemed is bought. So what he's saying is, look at what happened. God gave you, by adopting you, he brought you into a family, he purchased you, and in a quite literal way, you are not somebody that's a fluke. He chose you deliberately. And then he goes on and says, not only did he do that, but he lavishes on you all kinds of blessings and even makes known the mystery of his will. And it says, we obtained our inheritance through him. Do you see the comparison? The comparison is Paul is under guard by people who are second-class Romans because they've transferred in from a pagan world. And he is now hearing from churches that feel like they are second-class Christians because they're not Jewish in background. And he says, I want you to know something. God chose you. God adopted you. God lavished on you. God gave you an inheritance. You know the process of going from being a barbarian to being a Roman. I want to tell you the process of going from being a pagan to being a Christian. And by the end of this, he says, I need you to understand, I need the eyes of your heart to be enlightened. I need you to gain understanding that Jesus has incredible power, verse 19. God gave him power, raised him from the dead, seated him in heavenly places, and put everything under his subjection. So there is no rival power to Jesus. Does everybody follow the first chapter? Good. Take a look at the second chapter and let me see if I can get you to underline appropriately. All right? In verse 1, you were dead in sins. Verse 4, but God. Verse 5, made us alive. Verse 6, and raised us up and seated us in heaven. 7, to show his grace. To show his grace. Verse 8, by grace, saved. Gift. Nine, not works. 10, we are his workmanship. By the way, you make a note, workmanship here is poema. It's the word from which we get poem. Okay. 11, therefore remember formerly Gentiles. If someone asks, you are not a Gentile, you're a Christian. You used to be a Gentile. Okay? Formerly Gentiles. What's that?
I just thought that was confusing because we're told all the time that we're Gentiles.
Well, you're non-Jewish.
So we're Gentiles.
No, you're Christians. Formerly Gentiles. Now, I need you to do something, but you're going to have to really focus now, Zoe. You ready? Okay, I want you to underline the following words, and then we're going to draw a line from Gentiles down to these words, okay? In verse 12, were separate, excluded, strangers, no hope, without God. Now I want you to take a line between Gentiles down to separate, Gentiles down to excluded, Gentiles down to strangers, Gentiles down to no hope, Gentiles down to without God. You used to be a Gentile, described as a person who is separate, excluded, stranger, no hope, without God. Or you could spell it easily, L-O-S-T. Okay? Verse 13. Now brought near by Christ. And if you need it, put in blood of Christ, if you're still stuck on the atonement message. Verse 14. He is our peace. Broke down barrier. Verse 15, make one new man. 16, one body. 15 was make one new man. 16, one body. 19, you are no longer strangers, but fellow citizens. 21, temple. 22, built together. Do you all understand how I conceptualize the idea that his teaching in Ephesians was a reflection of what was going on in the empire? Clearly, he's talking about people in a spiritual context that were not a people before, but became part of the people, that they were not fellow citizens, they were strangers, but became part of the country, the citizenry. Okay? So what I think is going on is Paul's under arrest. He's listening to soldiers talk about how they've gone from being Gauls to being Romans. We know very well documented that they're the ones who were doing the light chain service, and perhaps they're feeling like they're second-class Romans. Then he's getting letters from the churches who feel like they're second-class Christians, and he compares one to the other. And he says under the section in chapters 1, 2, and 3, your call is very simple. God chose you. You're not a mistake. You're not an accident. God deliberately moved you from being a stranger, lost with no hope, and made you part of the fellow citizenry. You're not second-class citizens. You're citizens. Now, to the Ephesians, the underlying current is that somehow they're not as good as those who come from a Judaic background. But go back to chapter 2 and see that he begins your Christian life from deadness. You started off dead. Remember, for a Christian, death is disconnection from God. You've already been dead. Now you're alive and you'll never die. So the meaning of death and life is different for a believer than for the world. For the world, they think that they're alive until their body dies. That's true within a frame. But in the larger frame of the spiritual reality, you were dead in trespasses and sins. Now you have a relationship with God, and though your body dies, you shall never die. Now, if you go down to verse 4, God, because of his mercy, made us alive. He raised us up. He seated us in heavenly places. And he does that so that he can show the surpassing riches of his love and his grace. And that grace is the mechanism of salvation. Let's say it again. What is the formula of salvation for every age? Salvation is always by what? By grace through faith. Let's take it apart. By grace. What does that mean? By the unmerited favor of God. That means no one ever earned God's salvation. It was always a gracious gift because we never could do enough. It could never be enough. Through what? Faith, which is what? God glasses. Seeing it the way God says it is rather than the way my eye sees it if I don't understand it through a biblical worldview. So, in every age, though the content of faith changes, the mechanism or process is the same. By God's grace through my faith, always. David was saved the same way you are. The content of his faith may have been different, but it was always by God's grace through seeing it the way God had said what it was at the time in which he was alive. Okay? So when you come down to the end of chapter 2, we're supposed to remember that we used to be a series of things. lost strangers, etc. But now we're citizens, we're fellow citizens, we're not strangers, but saints and part of God's household. We are now adopted into a family and we belong to that family. Don't let anyone tell you you're not fully part of that family. Is everybody tracking with his argument? Good. Go to chapter 3 very quickly. You're doing great. In chapter 3, for this reason, here we go. For this reason I, verse 3, wrote. Verse 4, when you read, understand mystery. Verse 5, now revealed. Put a box around verse 6. To be specific that the Gentiles are fellow heirs and fellow members of the body and fellow partakers of the promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel. That's the main point. His main point is that there used to be something that was a mystery to prophets. They didn't know it was coming. They didn't realize God was going to open up to the world the salvation. And because of that, it's now been made clear specifically that Gentiles are in fact full-fledged fellow heirs. You've been fully adopted. You're not less a Roman because you used to be a Gaul, you're a Roman. You're not less a Christian because you came from a background that was pagan. You're a Christian. You're fully part of us. And then it says in verse 8, to me grace was given to preach to Gentiles. Got it? Verse 8, to me grace was given to preach to Gentiles. Verse 9, to bring to light administration of the mystery. Verse 10, now made known. 2 rulers in heaven. What he's saying is it wasn't only a mystery to prophets. The angels didn't know either. Nobody knew what God was going to pull. They had no idea. And when he did it, it shocked all parts of the spiritual world. Verse 11, this was the eternal purpose. This was the eternal purpose. In other words, God didn't make up his mind on the fly. This was always his purpose. He just didn't tell anybody. Verse 13, therefore I ask you not to lose heart at my tribulation. Verse 14, for this reason I bow my knees. 16, that he would grant you strength. 17, that Christ may dwell in your hearts. Verse 18, comprehend. 19, love. If you want love of Christ, you can put it in there. Verse 21, to him be the glory. Now we're coming into the part that's really super practical, but I want to stop for the last part of this argument and simply say what he says to them is there's a reason why this is so hard for people of a Jewish background to understand. There's a reason why they're picking on you, telling you that you're not one of them and not as cool as them, because they didn't see it coming. But the angels didn't either. God kept this one close to his vest. He pulled this card out, threw it on the table. Nobody knew he had it. Nobody had any idea that God was going to play the Gentile card and bring a bunch of pagans and make them be fellow heirs with his own people. They were shocked. They were blown away. And even in heavenly places. And so now what I'm doing is I'm praying for you that you'll get the strength to understand what God is saying and that Christ will dwell in you and you'll comprehend the incredible love that God has had for you. And I want you to step back and just praise him because that's what he's done for you. You were generations from the ark. Coming off the ark, everybody knew God was serious and God was real. But then generations had tracked off in another direction. And nobody told you about God. You didn't even know to be looking for him, but God knew you. And God came and found you with the gospel, and God brought you into the family. So the call of the believer is a deep and rich process of God moving you from a world that was pagan and a you that was cold-hearted into a love relationship and a sensitive walk with Him that you never saw coming. And by the way, neither did the angels. You are not alone. So, but yeah, Merlin.
Does Paul get that from Old Testament scripture regarding the angels, or was he given?
No, this revelation is very, very out front. He's explaining how the gospel really wasn't foreseen prophetically. And I think you got to give a break to the Jewish believers of the first century, because I think a lot of them, they were running around going, look, you guys need to get on board with circumcision and Sabbath, because they had done it for generations. There was no other game in town. Now there's this, shocking, oh my goodness, there's pig-eating pagans and they're claiming to know God. Like, what are we going to do next? So they really felt like their world was falling apart. You have to understand how deep this was. Now, if your call did perform the function of moving you from being a pagan to being a Christian, you need to stop and look at one word. Before we take a break, I want to walk through something very quickly in 4:1 to 6:9. I want you to circle in verse 1 the word walk. Then I want you to circle in chapter 4, verse 17, the word walk. In chapter 5, verse 1, I want you to, or 5, verse 2, circle the word walk. In 5, verse 8, circle the word walk. And in 5:19, circle the word walk. Anybody want to guess what the next section's about? How to walk, okay? And he's going to give you 5 different walks, but he's going to give it to you in modern imagery and some images that are going to help you to understand. So the whole idea here is a series of images. Let me give you quickly what the images are and see if these help you. Go to 4:1, and I want you to put next to 4:1, walk worthy. I got it from walk and worthy in the verse, okay? Underline the following. Therefore, I implore you to walk worthy of call. Now, this is the image of a slave market. You remember that in major cities like Ephesus, there would be a slave market down in the major piazza or the forum, the open square. You would have a round disc, and that disc sat on a rod that would spin, kind of like a lazy Susan in the middle of the table. Each slave would be brought up entirely nude, stand on the thing, and go around like this. And you would look. And you would decide if they had the look of health that you wanted. And they wore on their person a titulus. A titulus was a marker. And it was chained around the neck. And it says, I speak Greek. I speak Latin. I can write, I can do woodwork. Okay, that's what's on it. And so going around, I speak Greek, I speak Latin, I do woodwork. And what happens is after you purchase the person, the titulus is the guarantee. You get that placard. It comes with the slave. If you get them home and they can't speak Greek or do woodwork, you can take them back and get your money back. It is a taxed Roman system. The Romans had specific order for this. And when you turned them in because they were unworthy of the titulus. Okay? So what he says is, as a prisoner of the Lord, I am imploring you to walk worthy to the manner wherewith you were called. That is, whatever Jesus called you to be, you are to perform in that function. And then he goes on and says, with all humility and gentleness and patience, showing tolerance for one another in love. I want you to underline the following in verse 3. Be diligent to preserve unity. Verse 4, there is one body, Spirit, Lord, faith, baptism, in verse 5. Lord, faith, baptism. 6, God. Verse 7, to each grace was given. Verse 8, gifts. Now, I want you to remember that when Julius Caesar conquered the Gauls, he had what was called a vers triumphalis. It's spelled with a V but said with a W. A vers triumphalis was a triumphal parade. And in the triumphal parade, there's an order to the triumph as it is given. The triumphal parades were for incredible opportunities of someone who conquered something. And by the way, if it's in warfare, usually they will wear red on their cheeks, and the red on their cheeks says that they were in fact in a bloody battle. And so in that triumph, there are generally, the following is the procession order. First, there's state officials and the Roman Senate. They're walking in the parade. Behind that are trumpeters. They're coming behind them. And then the spoils of war. So imagine guys who are coming by, and floats are coming by in the parade with all the gold and trinkets that are loaded up on top of there. And then usually they have pictures or models of all the cities they conquered. And then usually behind that, a white bull that is pulled along, and he will be sacrificed at the end. Not a good day for him. And then captives led in chains, enemy princes, generals, and leaders, especially those who will be executed. Not a good day for them. And then the lictors. The lictors were the guys who brought the fasces. Those were those very large things from which we get the word fascism. And they would bring them down to show the honor of Rome. And then musicians coming by playing lyres. And priests carrying censers of perfume will walk through the crowd. And then the chariot comes driven with 4 horses. And if it's Caesar, they're white horses. And he will be riding on a chariot, and usually someone will be holding a laurel wreath, a victor wreath, behind his head, above his head. Not settled on him, but above it. And the general's family will be walking behind him, or the emperor's family, and the army wearing their decorations, shouting the words, "Lo triomphe," which is the way of saying, "We are victorious." Then, sprinkled through the crowd are some dancing girls, for lack of a better term, that jump on the floats and throw what are called sparsiones. These are, you'll still see this in Mardi Gras, okay? They throw beads, usually colorful beads. That comes from the ancient tradition of gold, and they would throw it out to the crowds, and also tickets for free beer, which was very incredibly popular. And so they would throw these all over the place, and people would catch these gifts that are being thrown out there, okay? That's the image that you're reading about. By the way, this is not the only place you'll see this image. Right next to this, to the section that we're reading, let me see, down there where it says like verse 11, down, he gave some apostles and prophets. Right next to that, 2 Corinthians 2, verses 14 to 16. Listen to what he says. Thanks be to God who always leads us in triumphal procession in Christ. It's this, okay? And through us spreads everywhere the fragrance of the knowledge of Him. Remember that there were censers that were brought through and everything smelled like a parade? For we are to God the aroma of Christ among those who are being saved and those who are perishing. To the one is the smell of death, to the other the fragrance of life. Here's what he says. You know how in the middle of one of those parades people go through with incensers? That smell smells victory if you're in the Roman crowd, but it smells defeat if you're chained up. It smells life if you're celebrating and getting free beer tickets. It smells death if you're one of the people that are being led to the slaughter. So he says, when we preach the gospel, the same thing that causes the other believers in the room to go, amen, preach it, causes the unbeliever in the room to feel condemned. Why? Because the same message that offers life offers death. It just depends on who the hearer is. So in this passage, he says, I want you to know, he goes from an image of a slave market, and he says, I want you to know that we've been one Lord, one faith, one baptism. We've been called together as one thing. Because the main part of Ephesians is, you're not second class. You're one thing. But when we were gathered as one thing, I want you to know that Jesus did something. It says, He ascended up on high, and and he led captive a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. It says, this one who ascended is also the one who came to the lower parts of the universe, to the earth, and he threw out sparsiones to the crowds. And what did he throw out? Apostles, prophets, evangelists, teaching shepherds. They're like beer tickets. Okay? Now you're going to remember them now. See? In other words, the idea was you're in the crowd receiving these gifts. So you as a pagan who've become a Christian have now an apostle sent to you, an evangelist sent to you, a teacher, a prophet, a shepherd. You have these people and they were prepared somewhere else and cast into your life, and these people were prepackaged as a gift to you. And I want you to know that you have them just as much as your Jewish believing friends, because we were called to one body, one spirit. Does the image make sense to you? So we have two images in the first walk. The first image is a slave one. Why does he give a second image? I think because Romans didn't like being called slaves. I think the first image is an important one. Walk worthy and read the titulus on you when you were saved and you are a slave of Jesus Christ. But I don't think that's a very popular image to use for Romans. So I think he comes back and he offers, wait a minute. Do you understand that one of the ways that God shows that you are full and equal partners in the kingdom is that you received gifts right along with everybody else? You received these people that are gifts to the church. I would call to your attention again, remember there are service gifts in Romans 12, there are manifestation gifts in 1 Corinthians 12 to 14, and here there are people gifts. This is not the gift of pastoring. This is the gift of the pastor. It's a person who is prepackaged and sent to you already. And his discipleship was carried by someone else.